News Drive on BBC Radio Scotland.
Campaigners say the latest figures in the use of e-cigarettes should put pay to claims the devices pose serious addiction risks for teens and young adults. The annual survey of Scottish households shows just 1% of people who'd never smoked regularly said they'd ever used e-cigarettes. Well, joining us now, Professor of Health Policy at Stirling University, Linda Bauld, and Andy Morrison from the New Nicotine Alliance. Linda, are you surprised, first of all, by these figures?
No, I mean, they're consistent with the data we see from other parts of the UK. We've seen an increase in e-cigarette use. There's probably now over 200,000 e-cigarette users in Scotland, and most of them are using them to try and stop smoking, and very encouraging that these data and other youth surveys show that there is no current regular use in never smoking young children or in adults.
Andy, what do you make of it?
Yeah, absolutely agree with Linda there. The 1% figure that was reported, I've got to read it out to you again. It says just 1% of people who had never smoked regularly reported using e-cigarettes currently or ever. Now, what that's actually saying is that within that 1%, there are many, or at least some, that have merely tried it and went no further. So if all this misguided hype about marketing to children is to be believed, then it's just not working. And there's only a fraction of the 1% of never smokers are actually going on to continually vape. And who's to say that they wouldn't have smoked tobacco if e-cigarettes weren't around? It's a massive health gain, it really is.
And Linda, I was quite perplexed by the kind of 1% of people who've had nicotine replacement therapy who've never smoked. I mean, what's that about?
Well, we do see that, don't we? So you've got around the same proportion of the Scottish population who've never smoked who are using nicotine replacement therapy as e-cigarettes. And, I mean, nicotine is a stimulant, so maybe some people just want to try the nicotine gum, for example, in the same way as Andy says they've tried an e-cigarette. It's really very rare. There are no health benefits to using nicotine if you're a non-smoker. So this is probably just about experimentation, using something that they maybe want to try. But in terms of concerns about health risk, we really should be reassured by these Scottish Health Survey data.
And do they cover children as well?
They go down to age 16. Now, we at the University of Stirling have looked at all the youth data. There's different surveys in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK, and of course the youth survey is called SALSUS. And when you look at SALSUS, which is 11 to 15-year-olds, what you find there is that there are no regular users of e-cigarettes who've never smoked. So there's been a lot of discussion about this gateway, that, e-cigarettes will be taken up. They're a route to new nicotine addiction, and of course they might attract children into smoking. And we're not seeing that. We're seeing no regular use, and we're also seeing, very encouragingly, of course, in this survey today as well, that tobacco cigarette rates of use are continuing to go down in Scotland.
I mean, Andy, do we know, though, that kids particularly are going to be honest about this? Because I think any parent of a teenager just now will have seen some of the children using e-cigarettes.
Yeah, well, some children will experiment. I mean, it's going to happen. Now, Public Health England have recently stated that e-cigarettes are around 95% safer than tobacco. So I'd much rather they experiment with e-cigs, Preferably they do neither, but, that's just not going to happen. So, let them try e-cigs rather than tobacco, please.
OK, I mean, Linda, though we don't really know completely, do we, what the long-term safety of these is? Should there not be some kind of age restriction as there is with cigarettes?
Well, the Scottish Parliament is now considering a bill. Andy and I were there a couple of weeks ago, both of us giving evidence, which will introduce age of sale legislation for e-cigarettes of 18, in line with England and Wales. And all of us working in this field are united in agreeing that, there's no good reason why a never-smoking child should use an e-cigarette. Children do need protected from spending their money on something that they don't need to use, and so that kind of age of sale legislation is really important. So we've got to strike a balance. There are still questions that we don't know the answer to about long-term use, but we will see studies in adults coming through in the future. And I think the thing to emphasise is we know smoking is deadly, and we know e-cigarettes are safer, and that's the message to get across.
In that case, Andy, do you agree then that there should be an age restriction on e-cigarettes? I mean, you were saying you'd rather they experimented with that than real cigarettes, but, would banning them help?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, there's got to be the age restriction. It'll never be 100% effective. I remember back to when I started smoking. I started smoking at 11, and you weren't supposed to be able to buy cigarettes until you're 16. It's not going to stop everybody, but it's got to be there. I mean, it must be there. And the same goes for proxy sales up to a point. Unless you've got a child that smokes, adults shouldn't be buying these things for kids either. It's just not on, really. Unless you've got a child that smokes and it's the only way to get them off, then no, I'm all for the ban on under 18s.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the Scottish research does seem to contradict quite strongly research from the States, which is suggesting that teenagers who try e-cigarettes are actually more than twice as likely to move on to smoking conventional cigarettes as those who've never tried the devices.
Well, there's a couple of studies that have been published in the US with really, really small samples. I mean, the last one from last week actually only had 16 children who were followed up who used a cigarette after they'd first tried an e-cigarette. I think the thing for people to understand is the experimentation rates are definitely going up, people trying them. But for me, from a public health perspective, what I'm interested in is regular use. We don't want children regularly using these products. And I think that's what some of the legislation is going to come in is about. But I would say there's a lot of sort of concern about this, but there's also a lot of hype. And sometimes these studies are published and people rush to think there's a risk. And I think what we're trying to do in the UK is actually do a lot of research, including by Cancer Research UK and others who are supporting this, to really look carefully at this issue and try and give people, particularly parents, actually good information.
And just a final question to both of you. I mean, Andy, are you surprised at how rapidly the sales of these e-cigarettes have risen?
No, not really, because this is a consumer-driven product. The products over the last couple of years have just been getting better and better and better, and it's driven by the consumers. The consumers know what works, they know what doesn't work. Unfortunately, we're getting people that want to regulate these things to death, and that's going to cause an awful lot of problems. And I dare say that it would actually send some people back to smoking if the actual products out there are going to be stifled in any way whatsoever. We've really got to let this thing take off. And what I would really like to see is stop smoking services getting on board with these things and showing people how to use them, giving them trial kits or whatever it takes. Bring this e-cigarette technology into their arsenal of NRT, and then we really will see a smoke-free Scotland by 2034.
Linda, what proportion of smokers do we think have actually used e-cigarettes to successfully stop?
Well, what you see in the English data, which is more detailed, is that the contrast between the proportion of current smokers who are using e-cigarettes and the proportion of ex-smokers has changed through time. So most of the increase that we've observed in the last couple of years in e-cigarette use is amongst ex-smokers. And what that means is, if you look at it carefully, is that the people who are using e-cigarettes are trying to do so to stop smoking. So, of course, you're seeing the proportion of ex-smokers using e-cigarettes relative to current smokers growing, and that's good news. And I would agree with Andy that we need to embrace changes. People have decided to use these products, and if we can try and integrate that with the things we already offer, like our excellent smoking cessation services in the NHS in Scotland, then we can definitely make additional gains.
Okay, thank you both very much. That's Linda Bauld and Andy Morrison.